Banyue is releasing as a Fire Rupture agent, and although he isn't the first, with Minato having come before him, he is our first limited Fire Rupture agent, and this is very much felt in how he plays. He has responsive controls, complex input requirements, and some incredible animation work. I'd like to also have said he distinguished himself from Minato in the damage he does, but turns out that without his signature he's not that much better, with undertuned multipliers and resource gain rates limiting how well he can do in high-level play. Although his scores aren't impressive, it certainly seems to be inversely proportional to how fun this character is, being easily one of, if not the most enjoyable character I've played so far. With tight execution for combos, animation cancels baked directly into his kit, and some crazy tech on show, he's got plenty to offer. If rather than damage we use fun as the metric to evaluate a character, then he's a top tier entrant, so let's go over his teams and how he performs in endgame. Although I should point out that there is a lot to this character, much of which I'll cover in an upcoming full guide. But to follow what's going on in the runs I have on Showcase here, you probably need an understanding of how he works, so let's quickly go through the basics. Underneath Banyue's portrait in combat, you notice a gauge. This tracks his unique resource, Wrathful Fires. It has a cap of 150, but once it hits 120, Banyue can enter the Visage of Wrath state. You want to have it up for as many stuns as you can, as in it, Banyue gets 4 stacks of Mountain's Might, which lets him cast his EX specials without consuming adrenaline. In fact, it generates 10 adrenaline on use instead. If his additional is active, then each stack used gives a 5% fire damage bonus for 8 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. And it allows for use of 2 enhanced basic attacks, a hard punch called Crushing Peaks, and an earthbending attack called Toppling Mountain. They will immediately end the Visage of Wrath state, and Banyue can't be swapped out of while he does this, but together they do a lot of damage. Before learning how to use them, it's worth knowing how to enter Visage of Wrath to begin with, of which there's 4 methods. The first and second are by using his Chain Attack and Ultimate respectively, which will automatically transition into Visage of Wrath if at over 120 Wrathful Fires once they finish. The third is by holding Basic Attack in combat, although this isn't something you should do as it takes up time. The fourth and last is also accessible by holding Basic Attack and also takes up time, but can only be done once per fight and only out of combat. It's called Immolate, and if Banyue is above 50% HP, this skill will drain it for as long as the button is held while building Wrathful Fires, and then immediately enter Visage of Wrath once it hits 120. It won't build any gauge past 120 though. In fact, if Banyue isn't Visage of Wrath, he cannot build any more Wrathful Fires, period, so keep that in mind. And wasting Wrathful Fires build is really bad for Banyue. Perhaps the biggest factor in his lackluster performance is his low Wrathful Fires generation. He builds 4 of it on every defensive assist, perfect dodge, and on his on-field parry, Immovable Mountain, which you can access by pressing dodge without any directional inputs while attacking. It also leads to a unique assist follow-up that generates adrenaline. If you time this on-field parry perfectly though, then you get 6 instead of 4 Wrathful Fires. The Wrathful Fires build has a 1 second cooldown for all of these, but this cooldown is not shared. If you perfect dodge and do an on-field parry right after, that will give you bonuses for both. Even then, assuming you perfect parry every move, you need 20 parries just to build enough to enter Visage of Wrath, which isn't ideal. So Banyue also gets 0.5 Wrathful Fires for every point of adrenaline consumed, of which you do so by using any of Banyue's 6 EX specials. Here's a good point to talk about his basic attacks, because Banyue doesn't actually have a regular non-EX special. Rather, he has 2 different basic attack strings. One you get by pressing the basic attack button, as normal. Pressing the special button though doesn't lead to a special, but a different basic attack string. To distinguish one from another, let's call the basic attack his light attack string, and his special basic attack his heavy attack string. If you press the opposite button during a string, Banyue will do an EX special depending on where in the string he is. So for example, pressing the special button during a light attack string will execute an EX special. Same with pressing the basic attack button during a heavy attack string. 4 of Banyue's 6 EX specials are accessed this way. Pressing special after the first or second hits of the light attack string gives you Lion's Roar, whereas pressing special after the third or fourth hits gives you Earthshaker. On the flip side, pressing basic after the first or second hits of the heavy attack string gives you Mountain Tremor, whereas pressing basic after its third or fourth hits gives you One's Path. But Banyue isn't limited to EX specials only after basic strings, as he can get to them via manual inputs. Not manual chain, manual inputs. If Banyue is in any attack animation that isn't a basic attack, pressing a set of 3 buttons in succession will also lead to an EX special. For example, if you press basic, then special during a quick assist, Banyue will go straight into Lion's Roar. Basic special basic is Earthshaker, special basic is Mountain Tremor, and special basic special is One's Path. Since you can input these commands before the animation is over, there's some cool things you can do, like having Banyue perform an EX special even as you swap out of him on a chain attack. Or you can input the command and immediately swap out of him and he'll still perform the move despite being inactive. These manual inputs are key to Banyue's gameplay, as if you do these commands while he's already casting an EX special, you will immediately interrupt him and go into the next move, a baked-in animation cancel feature, which can be pretty funny at times. Thing is, you don't want to cancel too early, else you lose out on damage. And if you cancel too late, well, you're just wasting time. We can go through the perfect cancel timings in the full guide, but in short, every move has a specific point in which it becomes safe to cancel out of, as it will still do its full damage even if interrupted. Doing this is the most efficient way to get the Crushing Peaks, one of the enhanced basics while in Visage of Wrath. Once Banyue enters the Visage of Wrath state, just holding the special button will lead to an auto combo, where Banyue will use up all of his Mountain Might on the EX specials and end with Toppling Mountain. But if you manually input at least 2 different EX specials, be it after basic attacks or back-to-back, then he will do Crushing Peaks before Toppling Mountain, doing some decent damage. Technically, you don't need to animation cancel for it, but you really should, as you do need it for Banyue's remaining 2 EX specials. You see, Lance Roar and Mountain Tremor both have upgraded Wrath variants, which can only be accessed through these cancels. Think of them as working in pairs. If you use one Path first, then interrupt it with Lance Roar, it will be upgraded. Whereas if you use Earthshaker, then Mountain Tremor, it gets the upgrade. But one Path into Mountain Tremor, or Earthshaker into Lance Roar yields no upgrade, as you aren't using the correctly paired attack. You know if a move is upgraded based on changes to their visual effects. Regular Mountain Tremor, for example, only has a Fiery Wave. Mountain Tremor Wrath, however, lifts up a Rock Slab. You don't always want the upgraded variants as they cost double the adrenaline but don't quite do double the days and damage, so that actually makes them a net negative. But when in Visage of Wrath, Mountain's Might makes EX specials cost no adrenaline, so might as well go for them. That's a lot to keep track of, with which attacks each EX special follows in his 2 basic attack strings, all of the manual inputs are for different attacks, and even what set does a given Wrath move belong to, but that's fine for now. I've got some mnemonic tricks that can help with remembering, but we'll leave that for the full guide. For now, just understanding what Banyue does and how he works is enough. After all, despite his technical complexity, his game plan is surprisingly rather simple. Stay on field as much as possible, using his on-field parry and EX specials to build his gauge. This will most likely just be looping Earthshaker over and over, as it has the highest damage and daze multipliers for its adrenaline cost. Whenever possible, make use of assist counters or perfect dodges into on-field parries. Then, when stun arrives, open with a chain attack to enter Visage of Wrath and use up the 4 Mountain Might stacks, ideally with 2 Wrath upgraded variants for the most damage weaved in between 2 chain attacks. Then end with Crushing Peaks into Toppling Mountain, or just Toppling Mountain if auto combo, with an ultimate if decibels allow for it. Again, Earthshaker is the most damage here, so Earthshaker into Mountain Tremor Wrath would be the strongest, but it's a hell of a lot slower than the one Path into Lance Roar combo. So depending on the team comp and fight, you might not even have time to fit everything in. Adjusting on the fly to get the most performative combos is part of his skill expression. There's a fair bit more to go through, like the exact perfect cancel timings, how and why to weave in different EX specials in the out of stun period, and even some fancy text, but we can leave that to the full guide. For now, let's just see what Banyue can do. Before we talk about Banyue's teams, let's go over the route. The goal here is to get 4 stuns and 4 Visage of Wrath states. Of the bosses I could try him against, it was only possible against Wandering Hunter, as without the adrenaline regeneration from Miasma Shield, it cannot be done. It also took hours of grinding to get this run. I think out of all the characters I've done creator server showcases for, Banyue has been the most time consuming, as it is incredibly luck dependent. In this route, the difference between getting 61,000 and 59,000 isn't skill as much as random chance. Either you don't get Visage of Wrath in time for stun, or you do, but take too long to get to it, cutting the final combo short. Given how poor Banyue's Wrath of Fire's generation is, I'd wish that the developers likely didn't intend for this to be possible, but hey, even if it's just for one fight, it's very fulfilling to pull it off. To start with, we want to use Immolate with Hold Basic Attack to build Wrathful Fires to almost max, but not quite. If you do max it out, Banyue can get a round start crushing peaks into Toppling Mountain, and get a fair bit of adrenaline on top to make building Wrathful Fires easier in the lead up to that first stun. Problem is, even with the extra adrenaline, the first stun comes a good 15 seconds late, else there isn't enough time to build Wrathful Fires back up, and this offsets the whole run, making it impossible to get a 4-4 split. So once you've gotten as high as you can without going into Visage of Wrath, it's on to Lucia for an early Ether Veil activation and a quick assist to Banyue. Here it works out well to do one light attack after quick assist, that being one basic attack, as using it after a quick assist shortcuts to the third hit of the string, then press special once for an Earthshaker. After that, another Earthshaker input and an immediate swap to Lucia, where we do 2 quick specials to drain her dream points. Stuns have to be fast in this route, and too often Lucia's dream state can get offset if you leave it be. Maybe you're lucky and it lines up with burst, but better not to leave things up to chance. From there it's rather simple. The goal is to stun as fast as possible, ideally over 230 on the clock. There isn't much of a need to build Wrathful Fires for Banyue, so just sneaking in a few Earthshakers for damage is enough. Prioritize getting defensive assists with Dialyn for days, and be sure to refresh Lucia's dream state at some point before stun. But aside from that, it's relatively freeform. When stun is about to begin, open with a dodge counter or defensive assist into assist follow-up, ideally on Dialyn, or use Banyue's on-field parry into the alternate assist follow-up, as that also refreshes wavering stacks. If the latter, Dialyn's fast EX specials are an effective way to start stun quickly, after which Banyue Chain is used. While in its animation, buffer the inputs for one path so that it executes even after cancelling the chain attack window. As you want to use Wrath variants for extra damage, follow it with a Lion's Roar and then immediately swap to Dialyn for a special or EX special cast to trigger another chain quickly. Then once again, buffer inputs during the chain attack animation for another one path into Lion's Roar Wrath string, after which swap to Dialyn to use her Hold Basic EX special so as to force a chain attack window into Banyue's ultimate. Yes, this does use up 90 positive reviews instead of 60, but we have plenty of time to build it back up due to the early stun. Right as Banyue ends his converted ultimate, go into a Decibel ultimate. It's important to do this before doing his enhanced basics, as Decibel economy is very tight, so the faster we're cycling through them, the better. Once it's done, hold basic attack to finish things off with the crushing peaks into Toppling Mountain. Assuming you open with an assist follow-up or dodge counter and cancelled everything correctly, crushing peak should hit while wavering is still up, and only Toppling Mountain doesn't get the buff. The raw damage multiplier from his chain attack, a whopping 1,121%, more than makes up for the wavering sheer damage bonus loss on the 1,739% Toppling Mountain, especially when saturation is considered. With stun starting at around 230, there should be at least around 15 seconds left before Wandering Hunter begins his phase transition, and we want to use the Spirit to build as many wavering stacks, Wrathful Fires, and Decibels as possible. From this point on, it's fine to do Wrath moves instead of looping Earthshakers, as we don't want to be animation locked when opportunities come to do perfect dodges into on-field parries. Where possible, try to get defensive assist on Banyue for Decibels, as he will need every last point. I should point out that Banyue's on-field parry is not a defensive assist. In fact, it doesn't even count as a perfect dodge, which means it builds no Decibels whatsoever, which really hurts his Decibel economy, hence why defensive assists matter. Lucia should be out of dream state by this point, but do not re-enter it, else that may offset timings later. As the clock nears 2 minutes, beyond Banyue to on-field parry. We want to interrupt Wandering Hunter so that he goes into his phase transition as soon as possible so as to not lose any time and hopefully be at or very near 120 Wrathful Fires. From there, swap out of Banyue after a few basics so that he can defensive assist in for Wandering Hunter's mechanic, buffer an Earthshaker during his assist follow-up, then onto Lucia we go to activate her dream state and use her ultimate right after, stocking on a refresh. Our priority is to go through Miasma as quickly as possible, shooting for a stun at over 135 on the clock, and Dialyn makes this easy. Do a full set of EX specials on her, then go into her ultimate. Since we used 90 positive reviews on the first stun, she needs to spend a fair bit of energy, so if there's any spare, make sure to use it. At this point, Miasma should be almost fully depleted, so some dodge counters or an assist follow-up will set up for the second stun and refresh wavering. Banyue must be at over 2,500 decibels as his first chain attack finishes, assuming that you've got anomalies lined up. Combo is similar to the first, but no double chain this time. Just one path into Lion's Roar, then straight into Dialyn's ultimate conversion. The reason for this is that we want to get out of Visage of Wrath as fast as possible to start building Wrathful Fires back up. So while we could fit in an Earthshaker into Mountain Tremor Wrath string with the extra time, we still want to do only one path into Lion's Roar. Unlike the first combo, we don't want to spend decibels right away, even if we're overcapping. Go into Crushing Peaks, then Toppling Mountain, and cancel its recovery frames with the ultimate. This is because we can't shortcut to EX specials via manual input commands after Toppling Mountain, but we can after ultimate, which is just enough time to fit 2 sets of 1 spot into Lion's Roar Wrath with all of that extra adrenaline from the Miasma Shield break. And now we're in the RNG trenches, as the 3rd and 4th stuns are mostly out of your hands. It's good to spend some of the extra resources that Dialyn and Lucia get from Miasma Shield break to build up days, but from there it's getting as many assist counters and perfect dodges into on-field parries as possible. Even if you don't get an assist counter, that's okay, it's less adrenaline build, but at the very least try and get the perfect dodge effect for Wrathful Fires. Honestly, just try to feed as many parries as possible to Dialyn and Banyue, balancing out days and Wrathful Fires build. Without Wandering Hunter doing the 3-string attack that ends on a kick, it's often doomed, so pray for good luck and capitalize on it when it does present itself. Stuns should start at above 0.55 on the clock, with Banyue having at least 120 Wrathful Fires, but ideally more. Combo is the same as before, with only 1 chain attack into the 1-pass Lion's Roar Wrath string, then Dialyn's ultimate conversion into another 1-spot Lion's Roar Wrath string, ending with Crushing Peaks and Toppling Mountain. Well, not quite ending, as you may have enough decibels for an ultimate, and better to use it on the 3rd stun rather than on the 4th. Here's where I showcase why running Devil Boo is better than any Firebank Boo. For one, Ether doesn't stagger Wandering Hunter, so not as many instances of him getting interrupted out of stun, which can end a run. And second, it still generates enough anomaly that it can sustain decibel build. In fact, often leading to disorders mid-combo that give just enough to get a 3rd stun ultimate. As before, 1 spot into Lion's Roar Wrath loops with whatever adrenaline you have in stock into a Lucia ultimate to both stock a Dream State refresh and build some more assist points. We need as many of them as we can get, then build as much days and Wrathful Fires as you can. Try to save Dialyn's ultimate to come as late as possible to maximize Wrathful Fires build, but honestly there's barely enough time to get enough. It's fine if Banyue isn't at 120 by the time stun begins so long as there's enough adrenaline to get Visage of Wrath halfway through. Stun has to start at 0.15. Although you do get a little leniency if you manage to use Banyue's ultimate on the 3rd stun. At this point, the run is done. Pray Banyue's got 120 Wrathful Fire so that he can build to it before Dialyn's ultimate conversion and burst as hard as you can. Depending on how lucky you are with parries and if you can set up a physical burn disorder on the final stun, you might be able to get a 4th Banyue ultimate, but the levels of luck required for that are so astronomical that I refuse to try for it. 61,200 is a good enough score as is, and even with the ultimate it'd only be another 2,000 score, so I think this would cap out at 63,500 with the build I've got. And attention should be given to the build, because it's a very good one. It is 35 substats, which I feel is an achievable benchmark for a well-built unit, but only 4 of them went to HP %. Granted, I'm not drowning in flat rows, but still, this build is certainly punching above its weight class and could be comparable to a more evenly spread 36, 37, heck maybe even 38 substat build. I don't go out of my way to roll for specific stats in the creator beta, other than getting enough crit rate that is, so I genuinely did get quite lucky, but this has to be acknowledged. Unless Banyue is rocking something ridiculous like 40 subs with this kind of stat distribution, I don't think he kills, although I'd be happy to be proven wrong. In case you haven't watched my Dialyn Teams and Deadly Assault video, I have a kill of Wandering Hunter on Yidhari there, except that her build was far more balanced, she had to use a worse buff, and it took me 30 minutes, not hours upon hours for the run. In fact, it was so comfortable that the 30 minutes I took wasn't for the run on show, but another, which was a fair bit messier and not as good. I then realized I had 36 substats instead of my usual 35, so I tried for another kill with the right build and got it again within 20 minutes. Time is not the greatest measurement of effort, after all I could just have been lucky, but let's be honest, although Yidhari does need some degree of luck, the disparity between it and what Banyue needs, in addition to the execution requirement, or to be 10 to 15% worse, isn't particularly inspiring. He is a fair bit better than Manitou at least, but only with his signature engine. I was scoring just under 50,000 with Manitou, one such run you can find linked in the description, yet many of my runs of Banyue on Puzzle Sphere couldn't beat that score. It'd be disingenuous to imply Banyue is worse than Manitou without his signature. Far from it, it's just that luck and execution have an outsized impact on Banyue's potential scores, making him less consistent as a result. There are ways of lessening the luck and execution requirements at least, as there's a far more comfortable and universal route with a 4-stun 3 Visage of Wrath split. This is in large part because the 4-3 route allows for double chains and double ultimates in 3 out of 4 stuns, whereas the 4 out of 4 routing needs that extra time to build Wrathful Fires instead, which evens out the damage somewhat. Unless, of course, you're even luckier than I, or have even more time to grind than I, and can manage the miracle 4-4-4 split, that being 4 stuns, 4 Visage of Wrath, and 4 ultimates, then the gap would be a fair bit bigger. Despite being worse than Yidhari and heavily reliant on his signature to outperform Manitou, Banyue can still score decently well when off-element, and if you free yourself from the shackles of obsessing over aligning stuns with Visage of Wrath, he can get pretty competitive scores in certain teams, specifically those of Dialyn. Honestly, there isn't all that much to say about Dialyn that hasn't already been said before, or rather that isn't applicable to other characters. She's the best stunner, period. A fact that does not change even when run with Banyue, despite him being arguably the most demanding of field time out of all damage dealers yet. Sure, Banyue does want to constantly be perfect dodging and doing on-field parries for Wrathful Fires, but the fact his on-field parry has no decibel bonuses whatsoever makes resource management a huge pain. You're not just trying to maintain his adrenaline and Wrathful Fires, but decibels too, and this is very hard to do consistently. Dialyn doesn't take enough field time to detract from Banyue's Wrathful Fires generation while still providing opportunities to defensive assist him back in. The raw amount of days that she provides helps a lot too, with a 5-stun Marionette rotation being surprisingly comfortable to achieve. Better than the amount of days is that she gives you final control over when it's applied, meaning more precise timings on stuns, making it easier to align them with Banyue's resources. In the Wandering Hunter run, Dialyn was overcapping on days with her ultimate at the end. I only used it because I wanted a stun, and having the choice of when stuns happen is a big deal. That's on a 40% physical resistant enemy too, and without using Tempering Body, the buff that increases stays dealt. Considering there's even less time to get to stuns with Dialyn due to her stun extension, that's very impressive. And talking about stun extensions, well, they work great. It's possible for Banyue to comfortably fit in 2 chain attacks and 2 ultimates without having to sacrifice Scratching Peaks or Toppling Mountain. Even if you choose to not go for the double chains, no problem, as there's enough time at the end to fit 2 whole sets of 1 spot to Lion's Roar Wrath Strings. To top it off, her special and EX special casts are really fast, which does matter for combos. You might think that if you aren't making use of double ultimates, it'd be enough time to fit in 2 Earthshaker into Mountain Tremor Wrath Strings, and that could help close the gap a little due to their high damage multipliers. Problem is, although Fufu's and Trigger's regular specials or Lucia's EX special can be used to trigger chain attacks, they're still too slow, and without stun extensions to assist, it means Toppling Mountain's final hit is likely to land outside of the stun period. There are ways around it, like with Lucia's regular special, but aligning that isn't easy. These fast, heavy attacks are particularly important for Wandering Hunter, as you can get an on-field parry with Banyue and start stuns at will, whereas most other stunners heavies take too long or cost far too much energy to make them worth spending. So yeah, Dialyn's great. Compared to the second best stunner option, she'll be scoring anywhere from 20 to 30% more. It's no contest. That doesn't mean that said second best stunner isn't great though, and she does deserve some attention. So make way for the Roaring Tiger, Fufu. Fufu is once again trailing behind as a top stunner choice, but had Dialyn not been around, she'd probably be the best. Probably. On the surface, Fufu is the easiest stunner to run within Banyue teams. He likes field time, and Fufu gives him plenty of it, making it easy to sustain Wrathful Fires. This would come at the cost of decibels, but the 300 decibel refund on Ultimate and the ability to overcap on them means it really isn't an issue anymore, so having to align anomalies as orders or just feeding Banyue defensive assists isn't needed. Her buffs are pretty solid, and on Wandering Hunter, the fight you're most likely to use Banyue on, she's by far the easiest character to do a 4-4 split with. With Wrathful Fires and decibels not being much of a concern, time to stun becomes the determining factor. As she has weakness matching and doesn't have stun extensions, that gives more than enough days. In fact, in the showcase run, notice how she was getting the last stun at 21 seconds. Problem is, a lot of the things that make Fufu great also hold her back. Yes, she is stunning with time to spare, but that's so fast that building wavering stacks on Wandering Hunter can get difficult. Actually, if we look at it again, she could have built max stacks, but notice how, despite the yellow flash, Fufu didn't parry when swapped to. It isn't that she can't, it's that she stunned the enemy before the attack was due to hit. This is a problem I first brought up on my Idhari teams and Deadly Assault rotation guide, and it rears its head again with Banyue, except it's much worse. I'd crash out on how obnoxious it is and how hard it makes both starting stuns properly and managing wavering stacks, but something, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Let's roll the clip. Routing with Fufu isn't hard, but man is it time consuming. I think on average I'd get 1 in 10 runs where everything lined up properly. The showcase run is not one of those runs, which is why wavering is only at 4 stacks and runs out well before the final Banyue ultimate. Had this not happened, and you'd be looking at maybe 54,500 in score. Fufu really is a bit of a tragic character. She was always worse than Qingyi for Ishuan on Miasma Priest, was worse than Lycan for Idhari on Wandering Hunter, and now is worse than Dialyn for, well, everyone. It's not like her performance is bad though, it's fine, just that there's another character that comes very close to her in scores, and may even at times be able to exceed them. Trigger.
Triplets are one with the wind!
The reason I said a 4 stuns, 4 Visage of Wrath, 4 Ultimate split is possible on Dialyn is because, well, Trigger can do it. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough time to grind it out for Trigger, so 4-3-4 only, but you should hopefully be able to see the concept behind the run. Had I managed it, she'd be matching, if not outscoring Fufu. I don't think people do right by Trigger, because this character is consistently underestimated. Even without her additional ability active, assuming you have Blazing Laurel, she can keep up with Fufu in Day's application. And that's without element weakness matching, which is nuts when you think about it. The amount of days she gets on her assist follow-up is so ridiculous that stuns come almost as if by surprise. A parry at 83 on the day bar, and it's more than enough. She was actually one of the few characters that was able to sustain 2 stuns before Miasma Shield, and assuming you can get Banyue's Wrathful Fires and Decibels built, then it might even make for a more optimal route. Although it would take a fair bit of luck, it's very much doable. I was managing to do it, albeit a bit late, but I'm certain there was some improvements here and there it'd work out. Part of the reason she can even do all this is due to the amount of anomalies she builds. If you can work it into rotations, or better yet, try to line it up with disorders, then she equalizes the biggest benefit Fufu has over other stunners, Decibels. And she can at least match her in the other boons too, like giving Banyue plenty of field time and not being particularly difficult to work with. Certainly far less than Fufu, as you have at least some control of when stuns begin. It isn't perfect, as her long assist follow-up can be a problem at times. It's mandatory for her Days build due to not having her additional ability, and for Wandering Hunter specifically, wavering stacks are always at the risk of falling off mid-combo. But if doing only one Spark the Lion's Roar Rat Strings, Banyue can still fit everything in. If you manage to open with a dodge counter, then that's of no concern. You can even sneak in an Earthshaker Mountain Tremor Rat String and still land the whole thing in stun and with wavering up. Granted, she's only competitive if you have Blazing Laurel, and for all of my digs at Fufu, this wasn't a Yadhari situation where Trigger consistently scored better, quite the opposite. If you can get past the difficulties with stun and wavering stack management, Fufu will be the superior choice unless you're able to get a 4-4-4 split with Trigger. As for the other stunners, there's none that I'd really recommend, but they're usable. From an A-rank perspective, Pulchra can kind of work. She offers some degree of buff value if at M6, and as is the case with the other Aftershock stunners, affords Banyue the time he needs to build Wrathful Fires. Although Banyue has no regular specials to trigger Pulchra's Hunter's Gate, he is constantly using EX specials, so unlike Atari, he has consistent ways to activate it, meaning that Pulchra has a fairly high uptime on her main method of building Days. It does need some adjustments. Since Banyue's EX specials have a cancel timing, it means their heavy attacks are offset. If you do a Banyue EX special, even if you think you've landed it, you might not have, so be careful when swapping out, else lose an activation. Overall though, it's fine. There's this weird conundrum where if you use Immolate to fully charge up Banyue at the start, then try to build Wrathful Fires back up, for once, maybe the first time ever since her release, Pulchra is stunning too fast. If you don't use Immolate though, then she stuns too slowly. Even on Marionette, who has some of the lowest Days requirements out of all Deadly Assault bosses, Pulchra struggles to manage full stuns. She might be able to, but at that point it's better to go for a 3-3 split and be done with it. It's not even worth entertaining the idea of using her in Wandering Hunter, as there she can barely manage 2 stuns as is. For the S-rank standards, there's Koleda, and she also kind of works. She doesn't demand field time and can do just fine being occasionally swapped to for defensive assists, with the benefit of only using up 1 assist point, which helps getting more of them, and that means more decibels for Banyue. Koleda is functional, but the problem is that her one buff, the increase to chain attack damage, is something Banyue will rarely benefit from. This is because they depend on Koleda landing her EX special on enemies and, well, she builds way too much Days way too fast. You can entirely abandon the idea of a 4-4 split as good luck trying to not stun too fast if you have any desire to set up her buff. It's to the point where if I was unloading the energy from Miasma Shield Break after the second stun, I'd be hitting the third before the clock had even crossed a minute remaining. I think this might be one of the few times I recommend Pulchra over Koleda, but only in fights where there's no physical resistance, so as far as free-to-play options go, she's the pick for Wandering Hunter. If we now go to the limited S ranks, we can talk about Qingyi, but she is not very good here. The reason should be obvious, namely that she demands way too much field time to build up Flash Connect voltage. Needing 2 uses of her enhanced basic attack before every stun means you can give up on the idea of a 4-4 split. It's 3-4 max. Even then you're cutting it close. If her roadmap is used, then you get to do like 2 Banyue EX specials and that's it. Enemy's already stunned. On Wandering Hunter, I just about get enough Wrathful Fires in time for the second stun, the Miasma Shield one, and that's without using her roadmap for Miasma Shred. Else it'd go through too quickly for Banyue to keep up. It's not an unplayable combo, but it's an uncomfortable one, where balancing out both Qingyi and Banyue's resource requirements is not easy. Better than Pulchra or Koleda due to the ridiculous stun damage multiplier bonuses she offers, but far from an optimal pick. There's one more limited stunner that can be used, that being Lighter. He'd only be worth using with Orphie on the team, and it's not too bad. Orphie contributes non-negligible amounts of damage, and Lighter isn't really all that demanding of field time, so Banyue shouldn't struggle too much to build Wrathful Fires. Shouldn't, as opposed to doesn't, because it is something you need to work around. Wandering Hunter, I'd be stunning so fast that I couldn't even build up 5 waving stacks before the first stun. Never mind pushing for a 230 stun, ladder was managing 240 with ease. It has more issues too, as having a triple fire team isn't as good as you might think. Anomaly builds so quickly that weak enemies can be interrupted when you least want them to, getting in the way of Banyue's resource generation and stun setup. It does help with decibels, but that alone isn't enough. Orphie's personal decibel build is poor, which leads to prioritization problems. You want to parry on ladder for days, you want to parry on Banyue for decibels, but you also want to parry on Orphie for decibels. Even if you feed her a lot of parries, she struggles to keep up. I'd often be going into stuns, and although I could have Banyue's ultimate ready, Orphie's wouldn't be. Maybe it'd be coming up right as the stun ends, but that's a little too late. It's also incredibly difficult to line up her zeroed in. Ideally, you'd use heat charge right as the stun begins, applying the buff and getting some damage in. As Banyue wants to double chain, it's then a good opportunity to swap to her an ultimate, setting her before ladder on the team order so she quick assists him in and another chain is triggered. All sounds great, and I could do it on some stuns, but most of the time this is very hard to pull off. Heat charge takes such a long time to cast in full that if you truly do open stun with it, Orphie is swap locked, as she's still in the heat charge animation by the time Banyue's done his chain and EX special strings, forcing you into a ladder swap instead. It doesn't always ruin the combo entirely, as ladder can still quick assist in for a chain trigger, but it means not getting Orphie's ultimate off. And I haven't even talked about how hard it is to build up enough bottled heat for every stun. What all these little things amount to is a comp that's remarkably difficult to route around, and it's something that should only be considered if Lucia isn't available. Almost any other stunner with Lucia is likely to outscore a lighter Orphie team on Wandering Hunter, although they can be a bit more competitive in different fights where Orphie's damage isn't tanked by high defense values. Another non-Lucia option is Pan, and he's the only one left really. I'll keep it short, there isn't all that much to say about him. He's going to be better than any other defense or support character not named Lucia. Yes, even Astra, being the dedicated A-rank Rupture helping hand. His personal days isn't all that great, but being able to run Caesar's signature engine on him makes it a lot easier to push for 4 stuns. Even if running him with Dialyn does mean giving up on her additional abilities damage increase to her EX specials, at 40% physical resistance, it isn't that big a loss. She's such a busted character anyways that a Banyue Pan Dialyn team could keep up with a Banyue Fufu Lucia one. There's other characters we could go over, but either I haven't really labbed them at all, I most certainly wasn't bothered to know how a Banyue Ambi Lucy team performed, or I didn't feel them worth using. Astra sees many of the issues I had previously highlighted on her for Idhari, with bad engine compatibility for rupture agents and precise assist prompts being cumbersome. It's even worse for Banyue, as days and decibel requirements are a really big deal, and her inability to parry hurts, making a full force split even harder than it already is. She's especially bad with Dialyn, as it makes it really difficult to get double chain, double ultimate combos. If Dialyn triggers a chain with her quick assist, that leads to her ultimate conversion, which means needing to use manual chain to stop that from happening and then manually triggering it with another skill. The added delay that comes with this means it's not possible to fit everything in stun, with much of Toppling Mountain landing outside of it. Given she buffs about as much as Pan, it isn't worth the hassle. Caesar would deserve a mention, but come on, Pan provides far more value than she does. Her buffs drop when characters are swapped out of, meaning Banyue loses out often in the out of stun period, and for at least 2 of Banyue's EX specials and combos. To give her some credit, even with 40% physical resistance on Wandering Hunter, her days build is still really good when paired with Dialyn. It's to the point that without any Dialyn EX specials or ultimate, I was able to build 80% days before Miasma Shield. Doing 2 stuns pre-Miasma with her could work out, but it's still score less than Pan. I think we can call it here for Banyue's teams. While I may have come across as a bit of a Debbie Downer in regards to his performance, I hope that doesn't mask the excitement that I genuinely hold for this character. He is fun, really fun to play. Banyue isn't a meta character, and there is not a single encounter in this game that he would be considered best for, being outclassed by at least one but often multiple agents at every turn. Yet the fulfillment that comes from mastering him is its own reward, where it's about embracing the challenge and enjoying the experience. Zenless Zone Zero is a game after all, and while there's different ways in which people approach fun, Banyue more than does it for me. And my evaluation is derived from the limited time that I had with him in the Creator Experience server. Who knows, we might just see a How to Master moment where as routes are further refined or more tech is found, Banyue's true potential is unveiled. Then again, I'm the kind of person who M6 Hugo, so take this glazing with a grain of salt. I might be a little biased. I think that's enough words from me. For now at least. There will be another guide coming that will go into more depth into his kit, tags, and builds, so why not like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified for when it drops. I've got more videos coming. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.